The topic that I want to talk about this evening is a topic that's rarely, if ever, discussed. So if you don't mind, and I hope nobody was expecting me to play the harp, if you did, then you can leave now. Is that fair enough? But what I'd like to do is to focus on this topic, and hopefully, when this lecture is finished, you will be more informed about the harp symbol, and certainly, whatever else, you will never quite look at the Irish harp image in quite the same way again, and I can guarantee that. So to begin, the 21st of January 2019 marked the centenary of a ceremony called the Turning of the Harp. On this day at midday every year, members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and their supporters gather in Dublin, usually inside or outside the Mansion House, where William James Maguire, the President of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and Keeper of the Sovereign Seal of Dáil Éireann, elevates and turns the seal, quote, from the rising sun to the setting sun, from north to south and from east to west, and from pagan to Christian to sovereign on behalf of the sovereign people and the sovereign Republic of Éire, end quote. The Irish sovereign seal consists of a harp with 12 strings on a wooden plinth, and the number of strings is derived from the 4 elements, our 5 senses, and the Trinity. According to Maguire, this turning, which is performed in order to establish the sovereignty of all organs of the state, including the Dáil and courts, must be witnessed by An Taoiseach, the Ceann Comhairle, and the Chief Justice, none of whom, incidentally, attend the ceremony. There is some cynicism about the annual event, with one commentator even referring to the turning as bogus and mere hocus pocus. Whether bogus or not, members of the Maguire family, starting with Tom Maguire in 1919, have continued this practice for 100 years. And that gentleman holding the seal is William or Billy Maguire. And you can see, you probably recognise that's right outside the Mansion House, on the steps of the Mansion House. And usually the proclamation is read, and then there's a performance either by a harper or, in this case, a piper. I think it would be fair to say that very few Irish people are aware of the ceremony of turning the sovereign seal of Dáil Éireann, and perhaps even fewer have witnessed the event. Over the course of the last 2 decades, there has been a growing national apathy and indifference towards the Irish harp symbol, its history, and its rich political, social, and cultural significance. During the course of this lecture this evening, I want to focus on 2 themes. Firstly, how the shifting interpretations and representations of the Irish harp symbol over the last 3 centuries have reflected, and in some cases anticipated, changing political, social and cultural values in Ireland. And secondly, to chart the decline in the significance of the harp symbol since the late 1990s, and to assess whether or not it is still a relevant cultural and political symbol in Ireland in the 21st century. Ireland is the only nation to have a musical instrument as a national emblem, and the Irish harp is among the 10 oldest national symbols in the world. The Irish harp, in musical and iconographical terms, has been embedded in Irish politics and culture for centuries. In fact, some form of harp has been played in this country for over a millennium. The harp enjoyed a high status in early Gaelic society due to the sophistication of the instrument and the considerable technical ability of the harpers. The harper, along with the fila and the rachra, who you can see in this image, the recitator, epitomised Gaelic aristocratic culture until the demise of that order in the 17th century. This year marks the 850th anniversary of the Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169, the initiation of colonisation, and the beginning of centuries of conflict with our closest neighbours. A few years after the invasion, Henry II's son, Prince John, made his first expedition to Ireland, accompanied by a Welsh cleric, Giraldus Cambrensis. Cambrensis wrote an account of his journey to Ireland and his perception of Irish society and culture, which was circulated in manuscript form from 1188 onwards. His description of harpers, their skill and their music is particularly interesting and undoubtedly contributed to the understanding of Ireland in England and on the continent as the land of the harpers. It is important to note that the earliest use of an Irish harp to represent Ireland and the Irish people can be traced back to the 13th century, when a gold harp on a blue background was cited in a French roll of arms as the arms of the King of Ireland. This association of the gold harp and the colour blue initiated the process of appropriating the instrument as a signifying image of foreign rule, or, as the renowned historian G.A. Hayes-McCoy described it, an heraldic device of the invaders. The harp symbol is not Irish in origin. Gaelic chieftains did not identify with the symbol, and the image was most frequently and consistently used in English or Anglo-Norman aristocratic circles. The inclusion of a plain harp surmounted by a crown on Irish coinage in 1534 under Henry VIII, and the incorporation of a harp on a field of blue on the royal coat of arms of James I in 1603 established the instrument as an emblem of Ireland under English rule. And if we go back to that coin, if you keep reminding yourself that the Irish harp represents the Irish people, and of course the crown on top of it represents English sovereignty. So that's a very powerful image, because if you think of it, Ireland, which up to that point had been an autonomous independent nation, now is being governed by a foreign king. And it's no exaggeration really to say that over the following centuries, various political and revolutionary movements made it their goal to remove the crown from on top of that harp. Some were more successful than others. Also in the early 17th century, the Irish harp was first used as a metaphor to represent Ireland in literary works written and published in England. In 1612, the English poet and politician Sir John Davis, who was instrumental in framing plans for the plantation of Ulster, wrote an account which credited James I and his officials with establishing peace in Ireland. He used the metaphor of the Irish harp to praise his sovereign, and I quote, "Briefly, the clock of the civil government is now well set, and all the wheels thereof do move in order. The strings of this Irish harp, which the civil magistrate doth finger, are all in tune, and make a good harmony in this commonweal. So as we may well conceive a hope that Ireland will from henceforth prove a land of peace and concord." The metaphor of fingering or tuning the Irish harp meant controlling the Irish people. And the figure controlling the Irish people in the 17th century was an English monarch. Unfortunately, it is beyond the scope of this lecture to explore the use of the Irish harp as a literary metaphor. But the rich layers of meaning attached to the Irish harp as a visual metaphor will provide more than enough material to discuss this evening. I should say at this point that the two most important things to remember about the Irish harp symbol are, firstly, that the image represents Ireland and/or the Irish people, and secondly, if there are any changes to its design, or if other symbols are combined with it, these reflect or anticipate major changes in Irish politics, society, and culture. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, there are three distinct phases in the representation of the harp: the plain harp, the harp with a grotesque head, and finally the harp with a female figure on the forepillar, the winged maiden harp, which was popular in the 17th and 18th centuries. And it's there in the lower quarter of that particular arms, and you can understand why it's called an angel or winged maiden harp, because of course the body of the angel forms the forepillar or the front of the harp, and the neck of the instrument consists of the wings. Now the thing to notice about that, there we go, do you see the angle of the strings? They're diagonal. And just keep that in your head, because that's something that will become very, very important. That particular harp with the diagonal strings is associated with the Anglo-Irish in the 18th century. The period on which I will focus is from the late 17th century onwards, a period during which there was a sharp decline in the performance of Irish harp in Ireland, and during which the harp was more important for its symbolic rather than its musical significance. In the latter half of the 17th century, a period marked by significant changes in contemporary politics and colonial relations, one can identify early attempts to modify the Irish harp symbol by adding other figures or elements to the core image of the harp, by surmounting the harp with a motto or slogan, or by visually representing the instrument in a state of disrepair to symbolise the neglect of the country. An issue of St. Patrick's farthings and halfpennies from the latter half of the 17th century included an image of a winged maiden harp played by St. Patrick and surmounted by a crown. And that's this image just on the left here. And you can see the winged maiden harp. Can you see the crown on the top, representing English sovereignty? And the person playing the harp is St. Patrick. This was in itself a very quite a seditious gesture, because up until this point, the only people, or I don't know if you'd call God a person, but God or the English king or queen were the only ones that ever took the role of the harper. So the fact that an Irish coin minted in Ireland is using an image of a harper, St. Patrick, to play the harp is suggestive that there's discontent, or there's something, the stirrings of something happening. On the right-hand side, you can see again the winged maiden harp. And what do you notice about the winged maiden harp this time? No crown. And that was an act of treason in that period. And you can see even St. Patrick has been replaced. He's been replaced by a female figure, Hibernia, the female personification of Ireland. And even the lettering, Hibernia, it's starting to sow the seeds of patriotism in the early 18th century. So it's ripples, that's what we're getting in this period, hints of something that's about to happen. During the 18th century, a winged maiden harp surmounted by a crown was increasingly used as the symbol of the Protestant ascendancy, the dominant political power in Ireland. I thought coming into this building here this evening that there would be full of winged maiden harps, but I have yet to find one. So if anybody during the course of the evening manages to find one, will you let me know? Because 18th century buildings will always have that winged maiden harp on them. Any of you that have been to the Custom House, on the outside of the Custom House there's a beautiful winged maiden harp. Even Dublin Castle has several examples of winged maiden harps. This is actually a wine cooler from Dublin Castle. So they were even putting winged maiden harps on their wine coolers to show their patriotism. You'll see it's a typical example, winged maiden harp with the crown on top. The throne room in Dublin Castle is the image that you get there on the left. And sometimes the images were combined with other kind of images of English or Scottishness. So for example, you see that winged maiden harp, and on top you see the unicorn, which I know my daughters will be very excited to see this evening. But the unicorn is a symbol associated with Scotland. So you get the mix of all these images together, which are surrounding the core image of the winged maiden harp. That's another image from Dublin Castle. Throughout the 18th century, there was growing disaffection with England, mainly because of the lack of legislative independence in the Irish Parliament and the tariffs that were enforced by Westminster on Irish goods imported into England. The formation of the volunteer movement and later the Society of United Irishmen reflects growing political activism in the late 18th century, which was influenced by the ideals of the Enlightenment. Images of winged maiden harps with or without crowns were ubiquitous on the flags of the volunteers. But when the United Irishmen adopted an uncrowned harp icon, along with the motto, "It is new strung and shall be heard," as the official insignia of their movement in 1791, it was an overt act of treason. And of course, the Society of United Irishmen, better known as the United Irishmen, were very much influenced by the ideals of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity. So not only were they influenced by the ideals, but they also used a lot of those symbols in their iconography as well. I suppose one of the objectives of the United Irishmen was that they would educate Irish people for freedom. So you get a very, very powerful propagandist machine at the heart of a lot of what the United Irishmen did. So they had newspapers, they had songbooks, they had flags, they had harp icons. Winged maiden harps without crowns on them were present in all of these different propagandist materials. That's their badge or their insignia there on the left. It is new strung and shall be heard. And you can see the winged maiden harp, but the image that's kind of against it is a cap of liberty, again associated with the French libertarian ideas. And of course the equality, the word equality is a very important part of that image. The images on the left are taken from the frontispieces of on the right, are taken from frontispieces of two songbooks that were published by the United Irishmen. On the left, you have the frontispiece of Paddy's Resources, which would have been published in 1795. You have the winged maiden harp. You have the figure of Hibernia. And she's holding a cap of liberty. She's positioned against a tree. And even that tree in the background is not a simple tree. It's a tree of liberty. And it's not terribly clear probably from that image, but she's standing on broken chains. So you can see how all these images are combining to tell a story, a very, very important story to Irish people to prepare them for freedom. Again, on the right-hand side, this is from the frontispiece of another collection of songs. This particular image uses the winged maiden harp, and on top of the winged maiden harp, you can see two hands clasped, suggesting fraternity or brotherhood. On top of that, you have your cap of liberty in a sunburst, and then Éireann go bragh, Irish men united. So it was regardless of whether people were Catholic, Protestant or dissenter, the idea was that they would all be united under one nationality. Now, in the early decades of the 19th century, the Irish harp was ubiquitous. It was a symbol in paintings, a metaphor in songs and literature, and its popularity even prompted a revival in Irish harp performance. Writers such as Sidney Owenson and Thomas Moore used the Irish harp and harper metaphors to address social injustices, in particular the extreme poverty of many Irish men and women. In songs such as The Minstrel Boy and The Harp That Once Through Tara's Halls, Moore used the harp as the symbol of an oppressed nation, an enslaved people and a shattered civilization. And I'm sure many of you here are familiar with that song. This is the first verse. The harp that once through Tara's halls, the soul of music shed, now hangs as mute on Tara's walls, as if that soul were fled. So sleeps the pride of former days, so glory's thrill is o'er, and hearts that once beat high for praise now feel that pulse no more. And there are so many other examples of Moore using the Irish harp metaphor in this way to talk about the oppressed Irish people. Contemporary artworks by Daniel MacLeish and others, the harp was included as part of a chain of images which presented a complex visual allegory of the devastating effects of colonisation and the destruction of Gaelic culture and civilization. Now, this is part of a much larger painting that many of you will be familiar with, The Marriage of Strongbow and Aoife, which of course is up in the National Gallery of Ireland in Merrion Square. And it's a wonderfully imposing painting that's absolutely enormous. But in the lower left corner you have this image, the harper. The harper is represented in a typical 19th century fashion. All harpers in that period were bards. They had long white beards, long white hair, green caps and wore green gowns, because that's what a harper looked like, and nobody imagined that they looked any differently. But this particular harp, he looks very, I suppose very depressed actually. Do you notice anything about his harp in particular? The strings are broken. He can't play them. So this is a very powerful metaphor because, as the harpists here this evening will know, those strings are broken in the middle register, the register of the harp that you most frequently use when you're playing pieces. So the fact that those harp strings are broken in that register means that harp cannot be played. In other words, the Irish people cannot have their voice heard. Now it's interesting because to 19th century audiences, they would have looked at that image and understood exactly what it meant. And that's what I mean, I suppose, when I talk about that knowledge is lost now in the 21st century because we don't carry a lot of that information with us anymore. Now you also get images of young, pretty ladies presented with their harps in the early 19th century as well. And it's not unusual for ladies to be painted with their harps in Irish portraits. You find it very much on the continent as well in the late 18th century. There was a fashion to paint young, elegant ladies standing next to their pedal harps. There was an ulterior motive for doing it because I suppose the fact that the lady was standing near her pedal harp showed that she was from a very wealthy family. And secondly, that she was very accomplished, that she could play music, that she could probably speak 3 languages, she played piano and all the rest of it. So the presentation of this image meant that she would be more I suppose, attractive to a potential husband. So it was a way of promoting your daughter by having her painted with the harp. Now, in Ireland in the 19th century, it was a very different approach. You still had young ladies being painted, or in this case, an etching with her harp, but the harps meant something very different. So Sidney Owenson, or Lady Morgan, the famous writer, is pictured with her Irish harp there, and she was an Irish harpist and a very patriotic figure as well. On the right, you can see Lady Elizabeth Cunningham, who would be an ancestor of Lord Henry Mount Charles at Slane Castle. So you can see that she's wearing a beautiful dress, so we know straight off that she's from a very wealthy family. You can see that she's playing one of these newly invented John Egan Irish harps. And these Irish harps were painted green generally and covered with gold shamrocks. Again, a sign of patriotism. In fact, in many houses around Dublin in that period, the early 19th century, people often bought one of these Egan harps and hung them on the wall. They never played them, but they hung them on the wall so that when guests arrived into your drawing room and saw this harp on the wall, they knew immediately where your politics lay, that you were a patriotic figure. So there's something unusual about this particular harp and how she's playing it or not playing it. Do you see what she's holding in her right hand? She's holding a tuning key. And of course, if you think back to the United Irishmen and even to centuries before, the idea of tuning the harp meant controlling the people. So now the harpist or harper is this young Irish lady who's tuning her harp so that Irish people will be prepared for freedom. Again, all little clues all combined together, but to 19th century audiences would have been very clear. From the 1813 onwards, an image of a harp similar to the oldest extant Irish harp, the Brian Boru harp or Trinity College harp, gradually replaced the winged maiden harp icon. This type of harp, often referred to as a plain harp because of the absence of the winged maiden design, was a recurring image in the iconography of various political and revolutionary movements, including the Repeal Association, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and the Land League. Daniel O'Connell's public image was carefully aligned with the symbolism of the Irish harp and harper. And they were, along with other symbols including the Milesian crown, shamrock and sunburst, prominent in the iconography of the Repeal Association. And on the left there you can see one of these plain harps, the next phase in development of the harp image. Can you see that it's placed on a bed of shamrocks, again, symbolising Irish patriotism? And it still has a crown on it. But the eagle-eyed amongst you will observe that this isn't the crown that we've seen in previous images. It's an antique or Irish crown representing Irish sovereignty. So again, this would have been quite a controversial image to place on a repeal association card, which would have been circulated among anything up to 1 million people in the mid-19th century. So it's an image that was widely understood in that period. Now, on the right, you have an image, or I suppose a lampoon of Daniel O'Connell. This is one from a British paper, and the British newspapers and the British media used to love to mock poor Daniel O'Connell. They mocked the fact that he had styled himself as a liberator, etc. So this is Daniel O'Connell on the right, and he's trying to wrestle a harp from Thomas Davis of the Young Ireland movement. And of course, they're not just trying to control the harp, or they're not just trying to get the harp from one another. The Irish harp represents the Irish people, so basically they're trying to control the Irish people. So it's a powerful image there. Now, as I say, Daniel O'Connell liked to very much associate with the harp and the harp tradition. And I suppose the fact that he was an O'Connell and coming from a very proud and noble Gaelic family, he wanted to connect with his Gaelic heritage and early Gaelic civilization. So he used to arrive at various different events on what was called a chariot, this very dramatic Roman-style chariot, where he would be placed at the top. And at the base of the chariot, you would have a harper dressed in typical bardic costume, with his conical cap, with his long flowing white hair, and playing the harp all the way along the journey. So the first time that there's a recorded reference to this particular harper accompanying him, and we know the harper's name. He was John McLaughlin. He was one of the students of the Second Irish Harp Society of Belfast. So he was an actual harper. But the first time there's a reference to him is in 1829, following obviously the granting of Catholic emancipation. So O'Connell, being a dramatic man, decided that he would organise a massive celebration through the streets of Dublin, and the chariot came out, the harper came out, and that was the start of almost like a trend, really, that this harper would accompany him to all the significant events or meetings or gatherings in his career. And I suppose the most significant one was at Tara in 1843, when there was a monster meeting held there where up to 1 million Irish people attended. And it's said, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but the chariot started off at his home in O'Connell Street with the harper at the bottom. The harper played the harp that once through Tara's halls the whole way out to Tara. So you can imagine he must have been absolutely fed up with that piece by the end of it. But this again was all very important, that people were connecting this idea of linking back to Gaelic civilization, the idea of the harp tradition, the idea of harp repertoire, Thomas Moore's idea, with freeing Irish people. It is noteworthy that during the 19th century, an Irish harp motif based on the Brian Boru harp, with some embellishment, was also being used on the lapel and cap badges of the Royal Irish Constabulary and on insignia of some Irish-based regiments of the British Army, including the Connacht Rangers. The crucial difference between the use of the harp by the RIC and the Connacht Rangers and various nationalist movements was that the RIC and Connacht Rangers harps were surmounted by the traditional Stuart or King's crown. The use of the Irish harp symbol on the insignia of Irish regiments of the British Army raised and garrisoned in Ireland during the 19th century, however, varied according to each regiment. The Royal Irish Regiment employed a winged maiden harp and crown device on some of their cap badges and a plain harp and crown on others. So there was inconsistent use of the different types of harps in the 19th century. By the early 20th century, most Irish people identified with the harp symbol in some shape or form. Indeed, the multiplicity of Irish harp icons used in Ireland and amongst the Irish diaspora in the 19th century was absorbed into the iconography of various political movements and military units in the early 20th century in Ireland and Britain. Many newly formed movements, such as Fianna Éireann, founded in 1909 by Countess Markievicz and Bulmer Hobson, occasionally used a green flag with a gold harp. And this image of the uniform of the Irish Volunteers, formed in 1913, included buttons on their tunics, which often featured a harp with 8 strings facing left, whose body was covered with an intricate Celtic design. Considering the ubiquity of Irish harp images in the early 20th century, one wonders why Patrick Pearse and others involved in the Easter Rising, and later members of the provisional government, chose a tricolour and not the green flag with the plain gold harp as the flag of the nascent nation. The answer is because there were so many Irish harp images being used in various different contexts in the early 20th century. Images of harps had become too familiar, confusing, and lost their visual effectiveness. As Seamus O'Brogoyne astutely observed, the advantage of choosing the tricolour as the national flag was that, quote, it would never be confused with any of the national emblems that were also being used by the colonial power, end quote. Since the foundation of the Irish Free State in 1922, the Irish harp has been employed as the official emblem of Ireland. In the aftermath of the War of Independence and the Irish Civil War, it was necessary to create political and social stability. National symbols, in particular the tricolour, the Irish harp and the national anthem adopted in 1926, were important unifying devices in the early years of the new state. A design based on the Trinity College harp by the English sculptor Percy Metcalfe in 1928 has remained the model for all official representations of the harp emblem on seals of state, Irish coinage and the coat of arms. In the period following the adoption of Bunreacht na hÉireann, the Irish Constitution, it was considered necessary to adopt a new coat of arms, which was designed and launched in 1947. An image which caused such controversy that it was withdrawn immediately. In an article entitled "The Strings Are False," which appeared in the Irish Times in January 1947, the writer criticised the representation of the Irish harp on the coat of arms. He pointed out that the harp strings were false and were presented in such a way that they were not vertical. So that's this image on the left. Many in government circles noted the criticism in this column, and Dr. Nicholas Nolan, Assistant Secretary of the Department of the Taoiseach, inquired from Dr. Edmund MacLysett, the head of the Genealogical Office, as to whether the harp on the coat of arms was, quote, by any chance the harp in the British Royal Standard, end quote. MacLysett explained that the strings of the Irish harp on flags and other insignia were always represented at an angle in accordance with centuries of heraldic tradition. Nolan responded that it was, quote, absurd that a sovereign state should in effect be told that it is not at liberty to regard a particular harp as its coat of arms because some obscure English knight may have adopted a harp with tilted strings as his coat of arms perhaps 7 centuries ago, end quote. The result of this debate was a redesign of the coat of arms, showing a harp with 30 strings oriented vertically. Although the number of strings can vary, the official harp emblem, giving the instrument with vertically oriented strings and placed at a slight angle to show off the sound box and its design, has remained constant since the late 1940s. The coat of arms of Ireland and the presidential standard include an image of a gold harp with silver strings set against a blue background. And the Trinity College harp is the main element in the seals of office of the President of Ireland and all government ministers and departments. The harp emblem is protected in international law by Article 6 of the 1925 Act of the Paris Convention for the Protection of Industrial Property. The harp emblem is protected in national law by the Trademarks Act of 1996, which prohibits the unauthorised use of the harp emblem and other state emblems or those closely resembling them without the consent of the Minister for Business, Enterprise and Innovation. And this is never ever enforced, as we shall soon discover. As the status of the country changed from colony to democratic republic and to membership of a federal European Union, this Irish harp emblem has remained a prominent image of stability and continuity. I suggest that this Irish harp emblem is a perfect emblem. Its visual potency results from its consistent employment by various institutions of the state since the 1920s. Why is it so effective? To explain this, I will draw on the German art historian Erwin Panofsky's studies in icology, in which he detailed how the study of art objects and images could be understood on 3 levels: primary, secondary, and tertiary. He suggested that the recognition of a familiar object is the most basic understanding of an image. So, for example, when most people anywhere in the world look at that image, they see a musical instrument and a harp. That's it. Straightforward, it doesn't mean anything else. His secondary level is concerned with the domain of iconography that links images with themes or concepts. So, for example, most Irish people, or those maybe familiar with Irish culture, would look at that harp and say it's more than a musical instrument, it represents Ireland or the Irish people. The tertiary level, often called iconology, is an integration of all 3 levels. So basically, for those familiar with Irish politics and culture, this particular image of an Irish harp is a potent emblem of government departments and governmental agencies at home and abroad. At least that was the case until the late 1990s, when, to use William Butler Yeats's immortal phrase, everything changed utterly. National symbols are not static. They must change, and according to the historian Peter Alter, can, quote, lose their political integrating force and their credibility, especially when the national programme for which they stand loses its persuasive power and is replaced by a different programme, end quote. Since the mid-1990s, there has been a considerable shift in the representation of the Irish harp emblem as employed by various institutions of the state. These changes coincide with a period marked by increased globalisation and privatisation, the affluence and excess of the Celtic Tiger era, the fallout from the banking crisis of 2008, the collapse of the property market, and radical political, social and cultural changes, in particular in the last decade. Since the mid-1990s, there has been a notable shift in how government departments operate. Apart from the considerable rise in the number of agencies to which power to perform governmental functions has been devolved, government departments view themselves increasingly in corporate terms, as a commercial brand rather than as a political unit serving its citizens. Leading consultancy firms are engaged by government departments and quangos to create and build a brand identity represented visually by a unique logo. The concept of branding has become an integral part of Irish harp iconography in the last 15 years. Terminology such as emblem and symbol have been replaced by the term logo, which is now the most potent tool in corporate branding and in the creation of brand recognition. The Irish harp emblem, which is regarded increasingly as visually anachronistic, has been replaced by a variety of harp logos, and with the exception of the controversial rebranding of the Houses of the Oireachtas in 2007-2008, the transformation of the emblem has largely gone unnoticed. In 2007, BFK brand identity consultants were engaged by the Houses of the Oireachtas Commission to redesign the harp emblem as part of a corporate identity strategy for the Oireachtas. And on the day of the launch, this is how BK described the new logo. Our corporate identity is an indispensable investment in our future, and like any investment, it requires careful management to protect it and allow it to grow in value. The harp, which has been specially drawn in gold ink, best represents the stature and position of the legislature. The green circles are in a lighter, fresher colour, which adds to our new modern identity. 4 distinct logos, there are another 2, but it's basically the same idea, or identity marks were designed for the Houses of the Oireachtas, Dáil Éireann, Seanad Éireann and the Houses of the Oireachtas Commission, quote, as part of a wider public communication strategy and a complete new visual identity system that unites the communication of all facets of the legislature, end quote. And that's very hard to say. These logos were introduced without consultation with or without the sanction of senators and TDs, and caused a furore reminiscent of the false strings controversy of the 1940s mentioned earlier. The logos, which cost €63,000 to design, were described as, quote, a washed-out version of the existing gold harp, a woeful waste of taxpayers' money, and by former Fianna Fáil Minister Tom Kitt as, quote, something you'd see on the top of a restaurant menu, end quote. In its monthly bulletin, the Genealogical Society of Ireland described the debacle as, quote, the insidious mania of corporate logoism, and questioned the legitimacy of such logos. The article concluded with a reference to the national flag, a national symbol which, because of its constitutional status, has escaped the dreaded corporate logoism. It is noteworthy that the Irish harp emblem is not protected by the Constitution, so any modifications made to the harp emblem are left to the discretion of individual government departments or agencies. The harp logo was introduced despite protestations and is now used on all official correspondence of the Houses of the Oireachtas. TDs and senators may, however, use headed notepaper with the traditional Irish harp emblem for their correspondence if they so desire. At a meeting of the Houses of the Oireachtas Commission in November 2007, the new harp logo was officially adopted, but approved with the proviso that the logo should not appear on its own without text. The idea of affixing a text to an image to create a context for interpretation is becoming increasingly necessary, as the harp emblem is redesigned or rebranded. Roland Barthes suggests that all images are polysemous, that is, they have the potential to be read in different ways. So the addition of text counters what he calls the terror of uncertain signs. So it's an interesting image what they've chosen. It is the basic gold harp, but it's surrounded by rings. And I've heard it referred to often as the hula hoop harps, because you can see those rings around it. But this idea of, again, if you keep reminding yourself that the harp represents the Irish people, what does that mean about rings around the harp? Does that mean that the Houses of the Oireachtas are running rings around the Irish people? Are they being ring-fenced? It's very confusing, and the fact that we have to think about that means that it's lost its effectiveness as an image. And it seems, and I noticed this image on the corner right here, recently, have any of you watched Oireachtas TV at all? Some are big fans. Well, this is the logo that they use for Oireachtas TV. Now, this is an image that has obviously been, somebody has been paid to design this relatively recently, because it has, apart from the gold circles or rings, it has nothing in common with what they paid out all those years ago for a new brand identity. When I began researching the use of harp logos by government departments and governmental agencies over 5 years ago, there were what can only be described as a plethora of green, white, purple and gold images employed on their websites and publications. In the last couple of years, a new logo and web designer has been engaged to work across all government departments. So thankfully there is now a conformity and consistency in the use of the same typeset, font and harp image on government websites. So you can see, and if you go to any of the government department websites, this seems to be the standard logo that's used, that gold harp with quite a flowery pattern on the body of the harp. And then you'll get the same font used for Government of Ireland, Department of Justice, Department of Children and Youth Affairs. Occasionally you'll find something bizarre like that rather odd-looking green version of the harp that they have on the Department of Arts, Heritage, Regional, Rural and Gaeltacht Affairs. It's a strange choice of green, I must say myself. It looks very psychedelic, but at least it's the same harp that's present on the other government departments. It should be noted, however, that some government departments employ a variety of different logos, which visually represent agencies or specific sections within departments, or which are often used on departmental publications. So to kind of give you an idea of this, this would be the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation. So you have the standard Harp logo that would be used on their website, and they have a different Harp which is specifically used for social media. So if you follow them on Twitter or whatever, that's the Twitter image that you'll see. Now that's completely different from the Harp emblem that's being used amongst other government departments. This is very interesting. Some departments have what can only be described as a selection of Harp images and logos to choose from. This is the Department of Foreign Affairs, the classic logo. Then there seem to be subsections or divisions within the department that use their own individual logos. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice something about those harps. Or maybe not. They're not the same harp at all. They're not the same harp. I mean, apart from the fact that one is green and one is kind of blue and the other is a darker green, these are totally different logos. So along the way, one department can operate with completely different logos. I mean, what comes to mind is the total and utter waste of money is all it is. All that's required is one logo and to stick with that. Sometimes shapes or patterns are added to the core image of the harp. The logo of the Department of Justice and Equality combines the harp emblem with an abstract version of the scales, the symbol of justice. And you might be familiar with their building on the top of Stephen's Green. Yep. So on the front of the building you'll see this, the harp in a kind of what looks like a gold boat, in fact, but it is the scales of justice. On their website they'll use the classic harp logo, the gold harp logo, which we've seen before, and then occasionally on publications they'll use a totally random, unrelated image. And the problem with an image like that or a logo like that is when the Department of Justice text isn't attached to that. You look at that and you say, what does that mean? What are we supposed to get from that? Is it the Irish harp, the Irish people in a boat? Are we rocking back from before? Are we trying to keep afloat? What exactly is being suggested there? So without the text, it just means nothing. Tony Shirato and Jen Webb suggest in their discussion of visual culture that signs take on meanings depending on the way they are arranged and in the context in which they are read. Although these modifications and additions to the Irish harp emblem might appear trivial, in semiotic terms they dilute the visual potency of the image and affect our reading of it. Images of the harp emblem which are modified confuse the reader and are uncertain signs. Many of the most unusual transformations of the Irish harp emblem can be found on the logos of various government departments. The harp logo of the Department of Children and Youth Affairs includes the outline of a harp incorrectly oriented with human-like figures taking the place of the strings. The logo of the Department of Transport, Tourism and Sport also includes a human-like figure, but it is intertwined with the harp as if the figure and the harp are in an embrace. And isn't that lovely? Completely unrelated to the Department of Tourism and Sport, but beautiful nonetheless. Combining visual elements is now a common practice in the design of harp logos and is perhaps best exemplified by the union of multiple images, including a fish, an ear of wheat, and blades of grass, which take the place of the strings, to form the logo of the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. Distortion of conventional images and manipulation of the dimensions of objects are common techniques employed in the design of logos. The result of these processes can be visually dramatic, as exemplified in the logo of the Irish Coast Guard, part of the Department of Transport, Tourism and Sport, which presents a distorted image of a harp resting in an anchor, undoubtedly symbolic of the Coast Guard's role in the protection of the Irish people. And I'm always very grateful to the late, great Micheál Súilwan, who was on one of his travels one day and decided he'd take a picture of that image and send it to me. And I've shown it to a few people, and my daughters in particular look at it, and they think that the strings look like sharks' teeth. What do you think? Yeah, they kind of have an air of that about them. The logo of the Department of Defence uses an abstract figure holding a spear and shield, which combined form the outline of a harp with strings. Perhaps the most dramatic and bizarre harp logo is used by a government department belongs to the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, which was established following the general election of 2011. The logo, which resembles an emaciated harp, is perhaps an ironic, if unconscious, visual comment on the economic crisis. And I suppose what's most disappointing about that particular one is I think we can blame successive Fianna Fáil governments for allowing the standards in terms of the harp emblem and logo to decline. But this was a department formed in 2011 when the Fine Gael and Labour coalition were voted in. And the first thing they did was to set up this new department and to take on this very bizarre image, bearing in mind that the department's role is to control spending and make sure there isn't overspending. And obviously it's been in the news an awful lot recently with the Children's Hospital, broadband and so on and so on. But to choose a harp that looks like it's wasting away, what does that say? It certainly doesn't, you wouldn't have any faith in what they would do, unfortunately. The Irish harp emblem is increasingly rejected in favour of a selection of fluid, oblique images of harps which reflect postmodern Irish society and culture. The political theorist Frederick Jameson suggests that postmodernism, quote, only clocks the variations themselves and knows only too well that the contents are just more images, end quote. Harp logos, as employed by government departments or agencies, are arbitrary images which claim to represent reality, but which in truth mean nothing. They are mere signs which serve no purpose, have no connection with reality, and are false images. The most diverse collection of false harp images can be credited to Irish quangos. Quangos, also known as non-government agencies, ad hoc agencies and non-departmental bodies, are the result of structural changes to government and the devolution of government powers in recent decades. They have been the subject of considerable debate due to a lack of democratic accountability and concerns over inconsistencies in governance. The common characteristic shared by all Irish quangos is that they are funded partially or wholly by the state and therefore accountable ultimately to the Irish people. At one stage, I think during the Celtic Tiger years, there were 850 of them, and that number has been reduced to about 250, I think, at this stage, but it goes through phases where there are new ones formed and then other ones culled and so on and so on. But the Irish harp logo or the Irish harp emblem is practically not used on any of them. So, quango harp logos are best described as a collection of ironic, comic, pathetic and bizarre images of harps. The logo for the probation services uses disconnected fragments of a harp which appear to be quivering. So that doesn't really inspire any confidence for the people using the probation service if the harp seems to be shaking. The image on the logo of the court service, which suggests a figure in a submissive, obedient position. And again, it's at the lower of the two images there. It's quite a bizarre image. Sometimes when you look at that, it looks like an animal, and the neck of it looks like the tail curled at the top. So again, what does that suggest to people using the court services of Ireland? Many of these images can be read as disconnected metaphors commenting on contemporary Irish society, politics and culture. The logo of the National Development Plan presents a harp which is tilted or on the verge of falling over, an apt visual representation of the current economic climate. The logos of the National Asset Management Agency, better known as NAMA, which was established in December 2009 by the Irish Government in response to the collapse of the Irish property market, and the National Treasury Management Agency, which manages the national debt, the National Pensions Reserve Fund, NAMA and New Era, are strikingly similar. Both are rigid, one-dimensional images whose diagonal strings are more reminiscent of prison bars than the strings of a musical instrument. BK, the designers of the NAMA logo, outlined their objectives for the logo as follows. In order to fulfil this weighty and economically important remit, NAMA needs to be perceived to be connected to the state, but not part of it. It needs also to reflect the core values, strong, fleet-footed and discreet. The stylised modern gold harp reinforces the organisation's nature as an agency of the Irish state. Overall, this corporate identity mark is formal and understated and in keeping with the nature of this agency. So the next time you hear about NAMA, they're formal and understated. The Harp logos mentioned above are only a selection of the gratuitous eclectic images that are a pastiche of the Irish Harp emblem. This collection of images of the Harp, which are aligned visually with government departments and agencies, are just random, meaningless images. I suppose what is more worrying is that although the Trademarks Act of 1996 prohibits the registration of trademarks consisting of the Harp emblem or those resembling the emblem, many companies in the private sector are using images of the Irish Harp that are abstract and often not too dissimilar to the logos of government departments and quangos. Since its earliest employment on the first bottle label of Guinness in 1862, the Irish Harp has been a potent tool of advertising moguls promoting a variety of products or services. And the Guinness Harp logo has gone through various incarnations from 1862 until the most recent one, which was only issued there about 3 or 4 years ago. So that's highly stylised gold harp. And of course, because Guinness had trademarked the harp long before the foundation of the state, they owned the image. So when in 1922 Sayers thought the provisional government decided that the harp was going to be the emblem of Ireland, they had to negotiate with Guinness to use the harp. And they were only allowed to use it if it was facing the opposite direction. Ryanair's harp logo, which is based on the winged maiden harp associated with the Irish ascendancy in the 17th and 18th centuries, is one of the numerous examples of the use of the harp in the private sector. So a lot of these images you would be familiar with. Harp, Lager, independent newspapers, of course, those of you that read the Irish Independent and Sunday Independent. Any Finn Harps fans here? No, nobody from Donegal. Oh, maybe, close enough. The National Dance Company of Ireland is one of these touring companies, very much like River Dance, Lord of the Dance, etc. And what's most probably disturbing is this one at the bottom. It's an electrical engineering company that just calls itself Harp. But you see the harp that they're using? It's very close to what's used on governmental websites, etc. So again, the Act is there in place since 1996, and either you enforce it or you don't bother, and they're not bothering. The significant manipulations and transformations of the Irish Harp emblem in the recent years have caused little or no controversy, and certainly nothing on par with the false strings controversy of the 1940s. Sadly, it seems that the Irish Harp emblem has no significant role in the image-driven culture of postmodern Ireland. In fact, I would imagine that the majority of people in this room this evening would probably not even be aware of the most recent reincarnation of the Irish Harp as the logo of the Irexit movement and the Irish Freedom Party. The party, which was officially launched in September 2018, was founded by journalist Herman Kelly, former Irish ambassador Ray Bassett, and former UCD professor of economics Ray Kinsella. The party, whose primary objective is to re-establish the national independence and sovereignty of Ireland by leaving the European Union, chose the Irish Harp as their party logo. It was an inspired choice, considering the rich historical meaning associated with the instrument. And there, the Fianna Fáil's harp logo, they're the only other party that have a logo which is based on a harp. But even if you look at the Fianna Fáil logo, it's very abstract. I mean, it looks a little bit like a flag or a standard blowing in the wind with lines underneath it. So Irexit have, I suppose, they've monopolised the Irish harp emblem in many ways by presenting an image of a harp which is so strong, which is so striking. And of course, then they've borrowed the colours of the Republican Party, the green, white and orange. Now, the first harp logo they chose was replaced by a harp oriented in the opposite direction for their nationwide billboard campaign in March this year. The Irish Freedom Party is a small but growing group who reflect the growing Euroscepticism and polarisation of politics across the 28, soon to be 27 European member states. The language the party uses on their website is reminiscent of that used by the United Irishmen in their newspapers in the 1790s and by other political movements in the 19th century. We assert that the best people to look after Irish affairs are the Irish people themselves. Irish people spent centuries fighting to be an independent and self-governing nation. As Irish people have no land to call their home but Ireland, we believe in the protection of the Irish language, culture and the natural environment. Now you can see that the harp that they've chosen is flipped around, it's turning the opposite direction. Now I have no evidence for this, but I think their initial harp was very close to the Guinness harp, if we go back. It's quite similar, so I wonder, was this pointed out to them and whether they were encouraged to change their logo to this one, which is facing in the opposite direction. If, as I have stated several times already, changes to the harp image reflect and often anticipate changing political, social and cultural values in Ireland, what does this harp tell us? I wonder if Mr. Kelly and his party are prophesying the future relationship between Ireland and the European Union. Will Brexit create a domino effect? Will Ireland leave the EU, join the Commonwealth, or become more closely aligned with the United Kingdom politically and economically? Perhaps not. Recent coverage of Brexit debates has shown that a significant number of British people know little or care less about Ireland, the status of the 6 counties, or issues concerning soft or hard borders. And it's amazing the way the Irish Harp kind of subtly has a comment on a lot of these issues, because I was amused to find that about 2008 the Royal Mint decided that they were going to update some of their coinage, all the coinage from 50 pence all the way down to the pennies. And a national competition was held, and basically people were told that they should use aspects or elements of the British royal standard or the crest or the coat of arms to incorporate it on any of these coins. Now, of course, Queen Elizabeth's face was still on the obverse, but the other side, basically the artists were encouraged to do whatever they could with the different denominations. So the Irish harp obviously still remains as part of the British royal standard, so it's in the lower left quadrant. And when the results were finally announced, you'll never guess where they put the Irish harp or the emblem of the Irish harp on which coin. The penny coin, the lowest possible denomination. So what that tells us about British attitude towards the 6 counties, I wonder. But anyway, it's certainly food for thought. Now, we've spent so much of the last hour looking at images of harps. Actually, I wonder, would anyone hazard a guess at how many harps and harp images I've shown you? An awful lot. You're weary from looking at harp images. It's actually 64. And I would say that if I went around the room now, people would struggle to remember 10 of them. Would I be correct? There are certain ones like the National Development Plan or NAMA, the United Irishmen, those ones are, you know, they're strong, they're potent images, we always remember those. But most of these images that I've shown you are insignificant, and nowadays the harp as a musical instrument has overtaken the harp symbol in importance. A report commissioned by the Arts Council in 2014 estimated that there were between 1,500 and 2,000 practitioners in Ireland. With the increase in access to harp tuition throughout the country through music generation and private music schools, this number has undoubtedly increased since 2014. I was a harp teacher myself for 20 years, and I am always immensely proud to see the students I brought to diploma level now teaching their own students. It is an exciting time to play the harp in Ireland, and with organisations like Crit Éireann, Harp Ireland working tirelessly to promote the instrument and to secure its sustainability for generations to come, the future of Ireland, of Irish harping and harping in Ireland is safe. When Aileen McCrann contacted me a few months ago to confirm this lecture, I asked her the usual questions one asks when trying to prepare a talk. For example, what audience are you pitching the lecture at? And she responded, highbrow, so feel happy at that. I asked her, will the audience be mainly practitioners? And so on and so on. So she responded, quote, it would be lovely if it were something that touched on an aspect of the harp that would enable us to reflect thought leadership in some way, end quote. So as this is the inaugural lecture, and I am immensely proud to have delivered it, I want to make a bold and ambitious proposal that will, at the very least, provide a topic for discussion during the wine reception which follows the lecture. 2022 will mark the centenary of the foundation of Saorstát Éireann, the Irish Free State. It will also mark the centenary of the adoption of the Irish harp as our national emblem. I would like to propose making 2022 the Year of the Harp. I'm already working on my contribution. It will be the publication of a comprehensive, beautifully illustrated book on the history of the Irish harp symbol, which will complement Seamus O'Brogain's pocket guide to the Irish harp emblem, published in 1998. In fact, most of the research has already been completed, but I am delighted the Fulbright Commission in Ireland has awarded me a scholarship next year to facilitate further research in the United States into use of the Irish harp symbol among the diaspora in North America. The 2016 School Centenary Programme Cuimhnig, Smuoinnig agus Samhlaigh, Remember, Reflect and Reimagine, was an extremely successful programme. Óglaigh na hÉireann visited every primary school in the state and presented them with a national flag and a copy of the proclamation. And my fondest memory of that year was one of the days I was bringing my daughters home from school, and they could only have been in maybe Nínon Bheag and Nínon Mhóra, junior, senior infants at the time. And I could hear coming from the back of the car something that sounded, lovely singing coming. I thought, that sounds like Amhrán na Bhíon. And they had been taught Amhrán na Bhíon at school. Imagine at the age of 5 or 6, most of us never had that experience, but that programme transformed the lives of those children in that year, and it was immensely successful. Ancestry projects, online resources, poetry and music competitions, learning songs and ballads connected with the Rising were just some of the activities which Irish children participated in, accessed and enjoyed during 2016. There was even a proposal at one stage to encourage projects on national symbols such as the harp, but this idea was not pursued. Let us seize the opportunity now. Could we put in place a project where harpers or harpists, armed with their harps and a knowledge of the history of the harp symbol, could visit every primary school in the country, perform for them, tell them about the instrument's rich music and symbolic history, explain that the harp represents each one of them, regardless of their ethnic background or beliefs? And you can see the potential with something like that. Can you imagine teaching history through the harp images and the changes that happen to it? Wouldn't it be a fascinating way to do it? What about getting children in schools to design a new harp emblem that they feel represents them in the 21st century? You could combine musicians, historians, artists in projects like this. I mean, it's endless, the possibilities. We are approaching the centenary of the divisive and bitter Civil War. This will be a difficult period for many people. The harp is and always has been a unifying symbol in Ireland. So why not take this opportunity to reposition it as something definite, not merely a meaningless logo or random image? We have 2.5 years to plan and implement this, and with the support of government departments, the Arts Council and other agencies of the state, it can be achieved. I look forward to seeing you all at the end of 2021 for the official launch of the Year of the Harp. Thank you very much.